If you haven't heard about Anchor, it is the easiest way to make a podcast. Please, let me explain. 1, it is free. 2, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from the phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many, many others. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It is everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So please, download the free Anchor app and go to anchor.fm and get started today.
The Ear, Evangelical and Reformed Christian Podcast. Welcome to The Ear, the Evangelical and Reformed, a Christian podcast that urges you to think deeper and draws you closer to God through faith. Through powerful sermons, teaching segments, and discussions, The Ear hopes to give you a different perspective on secular topics from a Christian worldview. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Please welcome your host, Brandon Queen.
Well, how's it going, podcast world? This is Brandon Queen, the podcast king, checking back in with you for another episode of The Way Forward, a Bible study for men. And last week we talked about, making it over the hump. This week we're on week 6, and week 6 is titled Men Need Competence. And we have the author of The Way Forward, Joe Barnard, present with us. How you doing, Joe?
Great to be with you again. I'm enjoying this, so I look forward to it every week.
Yeah, I know we're like quarantined, so, I'm surprised I didn't say you got to be video quarantined too.
Yeah, that's right. Drive us crazy.
Yeah. And in case you guys are wondering why I'm all dressed up, I actually still have to go to work. I don't just dress up to do the podcast. Sorry, Joe. I'm not dressing up for you.
I'm disappointed in you, but that's all right.
All right. So let's go ahead and dive on into this week's episode. Men Need Competence. Why this week's title of Men Needing Competence? Why?
Yeah. So, if we keep the big picture in mind, I think when reading books, we tend to get so focused on the details that, most guys can't see the structure. And I think seeing the structure of this book is important. It breaks into 3 sections. We talked about the problem. We're talking about the solution. We're going to get to the plan. But in this middle section, the solution part, we're describing the traits that you see in men that have a dynamic walk with Jesus. Not a list of to-dos, but again, various aspects that are conducive to growth. And so we've talked already about captivation, this idea that the heart, the affection should be gripped, having seen something of the glory of Christ. We've talked about the mind, clarity, and the need for a biblical perspective on life. We've talked about last week friendship, that there are relationships. So with competence, we're getting at the basic skills that are involved. And, we'll break that down further. But if for example, if a guy doesn't feel like he can handle God's word, if you tell him to go read the Bible and he's incompetent, if he's never had any training, he hardly reads anything other than his social media feed and the newspaper now and again, it's hard to open up, the Old Testament and begin to read it. And so that, there are skills that facilitate discipleship. And if you don't develop those skills, it frustrates your growth. And so that's why we're saying men need competence.
Yeah, I could remember the time that I was incompetent when it came to Bible and theology knowledge. I don't think it was until I was about 16 when my pastor, Bill Crawford, became my full-time pastor. He was 33 years old. And I would have to say that is the first time I paid attention to the gospel being preached. And it was just something about his first sermon. Now, obviously, it was about his lifestyle and what he was before he became a pastor and that good stuff. But it was something about that honest confession, if you will, to his congregation that drew me in to want to learn more about Christ and how he operates and why he died for our sins. And from the age of 16 up until now, I have been pouring my extra time, whatever that is, into studying the Bible and studying theology. Obviously, behind me, my beautiful background would speak for that. Most of these books back here are theology-based, Christian-based, and that's because I yearn for learning more and wanting to grow more in that. I remember a coworker asked me, I think it was last week, he showed me a Facebook post of, different pastors and how much money they're making. And we're not talking $50,000 a year or maybe 60,000, 75,000 cap a year. We're talking 16.1 million, 23.5 million, and he walks up to my desk and he's like, explain this, future pastor.
Yeah. Hey, a laborer is worthy of his wages, right?
Well, I didn't say that. I looked at him, I said, so why are you jealous because these people are making much more money than you? Like, how dare you? Jokingly. And
right.
I told him, I said, it shouldn't matter the amount of money someone makes as far as a pastor goes. If they got mega churches, they're going to make that kind of money. You can't control that. I mean, you can.
You can. It's called capping your salary.
Right. Right. Look. Nothing against Joel Osteen having a big church or T.D. Jakes having a big church. But I look at it as, okay, in my competency, I would say, okay, if I have a church of over, 60,000 members, okay, and our budget is, 160 million. I'm just throwing numbers out there. I don't know how this stuff works. But I get a $16 million salary. I would say, okay, I could live comfortable at most of $150,000 at most for a salary as a pastor. Now, I would take the other half of that and say, okay, I'm not going to do this alone. I'm going to bring in missionary pastors. I'm going to bring in discipleship pastors. And we're going to split that income, you will, amongst other pastors. And I think that would make the church more vibrant. And it would actually help men, if you will, grow in their competency. Just a sidebar.
Yeah. Look at Jesus and Paul.
Yeah.
They didn't major in the salary arena. Their values were otherwise. I think anytime somebody doesn't have something of what we see in Jesus and Paul, they're missing biblical leadership.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking, you're working for free. You're having to hope somebody gives you a bed for the night, hope somebody cooks you a nice meal, hope somebody lets you take a shower. I mean, I'm not saying that I want the pastors to start doing this again, because that's not feasible in today's world. Right. But looking at a pastor that makes $20,000 a year from a church, but yet he gets up there every single Sunday and preaches his heart out for the sake of God's people, I know where his competent level is, and I know what he is doing, and he's doing this when he should be making more, and he should be requesting more, but he's humbly accepting what the church can afford, but he's also preaching for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of Christ's name, because again, it's not about Joe Barnard making $16.2 million a year because he's a good preacher. It's all about God getting the glory for everything. And I get off my high horse now. So, all right, this week's topic is men need competence. All right, so competence is not a word that we use often in the church or in our everyday vocabulary, depending on what you do for a living. So what do you mean by competence? Is this another example of a secular leadership principle entering into the church?
I'll tell you the word that you hear a lot, which is equip, right? You have a lot of churches that talk about equipping their saints. That comes out, I'm looking right now at Ephesians 4 about the different gifts that Christ has given, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teaching, and he goes on to say for the equipping of the saints. And so churches pick up on this idea that we need to be equipped. Now, I want to draw a distinction between what it means to be equipped and to be competent, because I think there are a lot of Christians that in a sense they've got all the equipment, they don't know how to use it. And it's a serious problem, because the idea of competence is just that if you are going on a camping trip, there are basic skills that are involved, and if you don't know these skills, you don't have to be the best. You have to be some Navy SEAL, but you know how to start a fire, you know how to set up a camp. And these are the things that make that trip a success. And with discipleship, there's other basic skills that a lot of Christians don't get training within. And so in spite of all the programs that churches offer, it doesn't always get translated. And so, the examples are something like prayer. A lot of guys, we all struggle with prayer, but a lot of guys struggle because if they get on their knees, after a few minutes, they just don't know what to do. And so right now during this quarantine, you have all these sermons saying, hey, look, use this time for prayer. I heard a great sermon on Sunday, and it was about, really challenging all of us to invest in prayer. But for a lot of people, you get back to your house, or we're in our house right now, you turn off the screen and you just think, okay, now what does that mean? How would I even do that? And so competence, it's focusing on, okay, the individual Christian, what do they need to know so they can exercise the kind of gifting they have, but also fulfill the kind of spiritual duties they have as Christians. And so that's where I'm coming at. And I think it's important because if you don't have this basic competence, it frustrates an individual. I use the story in the book. I remember as a high schooler, I was told to paint my house. And I didn't know how to paint the outside of a house. I painted the inside of a house, but I just remember sitting out front just feeling paralyzed because I just didn't know where to begin. And, it was a very simple task. It didn't take much training, but a little bit of training could have gone a long way to make me feel like, okay, I can do this. I'm freed up now to do it. And so that's what I'm talking about. I want guys to have that kind of freedom that comes from being trained. And so now they're responsible to take that and move the ball forward.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I'm on the Revelation 7:19 for the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, and one of our reading assignments, which I'm glad I thought about that. I have to send the email after this. Anyway, one of our reading assignments was a book called Building a House for Diversity. And in that, it basically talks about the competency of running and owning the business and how to, do. You read the book before?
No.
Okay. There's a lot more to it. We only read the first chapter because it only applied to us, but I actually read it a little bit further, and it kind of pulls out that competent mentality that is trying to get people to, to realize what they need to do. And that's on business leadership, that doesn't have anything to do with the church, right? Okay. Well, yeah, it does. However, moving on. So what, you make the point that churches are set up around teachers rather than leaders. And oh boy, do I have a story for you. But anyway, how would churches need to change if the goal of discipleship ministries was learning well and not teaching well?
Yeah. So, okay. The idea here, this is good. A critical component of what the church is called to do is to teach, and it has teachers to do that. But so often the emphasis is on the teaching rather than the learning. And so you can have an eloquent, thoughtful, charismatic preacher. But the truth is, for your average listener, they're probably going to retain 2, 3, 4, 5% of what is said from that sermon. And everything about church, it's really, geared toward this mass gathering where people, the message, we sit back, we listen, we go home, but it doesn't necessarily translate so that I then know how to pick up my Bible and how to study it, how to pray with it, how to share it. And so, what I think what churches need to think about is we're not stopping teaching, but the goal is for the teaching to actually be imbibed and utilized by those listening. So it's learning well. So again, what does that mean in terms of changing things up? The classroom's not conducive for all types of learning. Most people that have any kind of manual trade, they don't go into a classroom and just listen to lectures about how to become a plumber or electrician. A lot of it's hands-on. They observe, they're delegated responsibility. They do it in front of somebody who's more advanced than they are, and they slowly get the competency so they can do the job on their own and do it well. And that's how Jesus, when you look at the Gospels, that's what he's doing with his disciples. He's showing them, he's giving them assignments, he's checking to see how they're doing, he's challenging them. He knows that eventually he's going to return to the Father, and they're going to carry on this mission. And that's the church